Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to introduce Andy Coburn, who is the Associate Director of the Program for the Study of Developed Shorelines at Western Carolina University. So thank you, Andy, for joining us
It's
today.
my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Olivia.
I'm sure you have a lot to teach us, so really what we're going to be doing today is learning from Andy about our coast, and I'm excited to learn too. There's a lot I don't know, but I wanted to open it up to start. What I've learned in terms of coastal restoration has been a lot of, for example, mangrove restoration, how that can help with climate change. All of my knowledge of coastal restoration has been in terms of climate change. And I know you were saying that's not always the case, so I was hoping you could inform us what is coastal restoration? What does it encompass?
Right. Well, before we get into coastal restoration,
Okay.
let me just say the Program for the Study of Developed Shorelines, which is a mouthful, we refer to ourselves as PSDS. PSDS.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've been around. I'll give you a little background on us. We were established at Duke in 1986, 85, 86. There's always still a question about when it actually formed. It started in the geology department, and the director was Dr. Orrin Pilkey, who is a world-renowned coastal geologist. And if you're in coastal geology, you'll know that name. And the program stayed at Duke through 2005, when it moved to Western Carolina in 2006. And so I came with it. And so we've been here 12 years. We do coastal research dealing with the geologic processes. We do a lot of policy and management work. That's my focus, is the policy and management aspect of it. And so a big part of what we do is looking at trends and the history and the benefits of managing developed shorelines and the impacts that natural processes have on these shorelines. So when you talk about shoreline, what was the term again?
Coastal restoration.
Coastal restoration. Okay,
Yes.
so when you talk about coastal restoration, that can mean a number of things, depending on the specific niche that you're looking at. So when I hear coastal restoration, the first thing I think of is restoring sandy beaches that are facing the ocean or an inlet. There's also restoration or resilience or shoreline management on the sound side, the backside of islands, which have less wave action and they're exposed to less processes. So there are more natural techniques that can be used on non-ocean front sides. So there's more vegetation, there's more land use planning options available for the backside than there's from the front side. So depending on where you're looking, there's really two discrete approaches of shoreline resilience is kind of the term that's being used now. So.
Yeah. So
I keep forgetting the word, the phrase that we're using.
The coastal
restoration. I don't know how I get drawing a blank on it.
Yeah. Well, so I wonder, so if coastal restoration isn't necessarily the term you use, what does developed shorelines for you mean? What necessarily is the work you're doing with developed shorelines?
Well, for developed shorelines for the sandy beach side, which is where our focus is shoreline restoration typically is referred to as beach nourishment. And that's a term that was coined by the pro-development lobby because it sounds very positive.
Yes.
And it's very simply a dredge and fill project, or sand is taken from somewhere and placed on a beach that is either migrating landward or eroding. So it's either the whole beach is either moving or the backside is stable and the front is moving, or most typically there's both going on. And the reason that is an issue on developed shorelines is because the beach moving isn't a problem. It's the beach moving into something that was placed behind the beach, which is the problem. And that is typically, depending where you are, homes, hotels, roads, infrastructure, and that kind of thing. So what we like to say is when we talk to people, or if I talk to my class, or we're in a field course, is an undeveloped beach that's moving isn't a problem. That's because there's nothing to cause the problem. It's not until you put something static behind there that all of a sudden you have a problem. And the most common way of addressing that problem, if you even want to consider a problem, is to keep that shoreline in place.
Okay.
And so when we look at developed shorelines, that is the key process that is being done right now, all throughout the United States, primarily Northeast, Southeast, Gulf Coast, There's some going on the West Coast, but not as much.
And you say the dredge and fill is what's keeping them in place or trying to keep them in place?
It's trying to keep them in place.
Okay.
And the reason it doesn't keep beaches in place for long is because the processes and the mechanisms that are causing that beach to move are not being addressed. So it's really a superficial approach. It's a Band-Aid approach, a lot of people call it. And so what it is just trying to keep that beach in some location at some desired width, elevation, length, for as long as possible. And as you can imagine, since the beach is being eaten away constantly, even when sand is placed there, even in a large project, it's continuous. So nourishment projects, which is basically what's done everywhere now, has to be done periodically every 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, depending on where you are. Nobody can tell you how long a nourished beach is going to last.
Okay.
But we can have some idea in general terms, based on where you are in the country, how long a beach will last on average. So for planning purposes, that's what's used. The reality is a nourished beach can disappear in a day. That's happened.
Wow.
It's rare, but it has happened. So as you can imagine, then there's a lot of cost involved. There's a lot of environmental impacts involved. There's questions about who's paying and who's benefiting. There's questions about where's the sand coming from, what kind of sand you're using, how often you do it. So there's a lot of issues to address when you're looking at stabilizing shorelines.
Definitely. I was wondering if you could actually talk a little bit more about the environmental issues associated with that, because I've heard a lot about, you're taking from one area out in the ocean and moving it to another. It's a different type of sand. It kind of changes the biodiversity, the species that can really function in that sand. So I'm wondering more about what are all of the environmental impacts that you have.
Well, we don't know the environmental impacts. We really do not have a very good understanding of the environmental impacts of nourishment or replenishment. It's also called replenishment sometimes. And so what we do know is traditionally, and the most common technique is that a dredge, which is a big ship, will go out to sea at some distance, the farther the better, and it will suck up sand from the bottom of the ocean. It's already been identified by a geologist or a geologic firm that's hired by some entity that wants to nourish the beach. They'll find sand that is quote unquote compatible to the sand that's on the beach. And the reason for that is there are a number of studies that show that the sand that's placed on a beach needs to be as closely matched to the sand that's there for the reasons, for environmental reasons, for habitat reasons, for ecosystem reasons. Up until the early 2000s, there were just a handful of projects that were bad, that put too much mud or too much shell or rocks or so forth on beaches. And then we started seeing that being more common. And so the program for the study of shorelines got involved with the North Carolina Coastal Science Panel, which was a bunch of geologists and engineers who come together once a month and talked about the issues, the scientific issues, and worked with the state of North Carolina to create sediment compatibility rules, which in theory was to prevent bad nourishment projects. And it has. It took 2 years to get in place. It's been changed over the years. But what it does is it forces communities or whoever's wants to nourish the beach to find better quality sediment, and then when they find it, the dredging company gets contracted, goes out, and has a device that is basically like a vacuum cleaner along the bottom of the ocean that sucks up the sand. And there's different mechanisms of getting to the beach, but typically it's pumped to the beach in a slurry, a water sand slurry, piped out, and then there's bulldozers and heavy equipment that form the sand into some predefined shape, length, width, and height. And so the environmental impacts of doing that are pretty substantial. So there's impacts to the organisms that live in the sand under the water. There's organisms that get impacted that cannot swim away from the suction of these devices, and primarily what we see is sea turtles get caught in that. Over the last 20 years, there's been a concerted effort to reduce sea turtle takes. It's called a take when sea turtles sucked up, unfortunately. And the Fish and Wildlife Service is the agency that manages the different regions and allows a certain number of turtles to be taken. And so, going back to the environmental impact, so we have mortality of organisms that cannot escape. There are organisms that, well, I guess the ones that can't escape are the ones that get from the sediment source area. So those impacts. And then on the beach, when this slurry is pumped out and then the beach is reworked, you almost unanimously agreed in the scientific community that anything that cannot get away is smothered and killed, because the amount of sand that's placed on the beach instantly with these bulldozers just kills anything that cannot get away, which you can't really, most people don't really see, or you don't experience when you go to the beach. But these critters serve as the foundation for the food chain. So everything that we'd like to see when we go to the beach, the pelicans, the birds, the fish, surface zone fish, all eat these things. So there are tremendous impacts as these nourishment projects are occurring. The question that nobody can answer is, do these beaches recover? How do you define recover? And how long does it take for them to recover? And if you're doing these projects every 3, 4, 5 years, is there a point where they cannot recover? I don't know. Nobody knows. And nobody's really studying that anymore.
Really?
Yeah.
I feel like that would be a major area of study.
You would think.
Yeah.
You would think. We would like to know the answers. There are very few people who do this kind of work.
Okay.
Most of them are senior scientists in their academic institutions.
Yes.
And they're just not really doing it. I just think the money isn't there, or the interest isn't there, for whatever reason. I don't know. But there was more effort in the early 2000s, mid to early 2000s, but it's just not there anymore.
Yeah. That makes me wonder too. It got me thinking about the kind of politics and policy of it as well. With I'm supposing, since it's just off the shore, that it's North Carolina jurisdiction. North Carolina decides what's done with the shores.
Well, if we're looking at each coastal state, the jurisdiction goes out 3 miles off of the different states. So within that 3 miles, it's the state of North Carolina or whatever state. After 3 miles, it's federal.
Yes.
And so that is, used to be the Marine Mineral Service, the MMS. Now it's BOEMS, the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management.
Okay.
BOEM, and there's an S at the end. I don't know what it stands for.
So does that mean that, well, I mean, I guess it does, each state has its own way of regulating these coastal development, restoration, nourishment projects?
Yes.
Nourishment projects. What kind of issues does that pose between, you're working on it here in North Carolina, what are the scientists working on it in Virginia, in other coastal states, and how do you work together to have best practices for each state?
Well, the way the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act is set up and came around in the early 1970s when the modern environmental movement was happening, it was set up to allow each state to craft a program, coastal management program, that was specific and individual to that state. And the theory was that every state is different and the states know best what they need and how to do things. But there are a number of items that every state must be consistent with at the federal level. And so when you're looking at nourishment projects in North Carolina versus South Carolina, maybe versus Virginia or New Jersey, there are some standards that each project must meet. But for the most part, they're all individually done by state. So the quality of the sediment, the amount of money spent looking for sediment, where the sediment come from, who's paying for it, all kinds of issues that seem like they are relatively simple, or they differ state by state. And so states rarely work together on these issues. They are not working against each other for the most part, but they're starting to, because the best, most compatible sediment that's the cheapest is the first sediment that people want, cheapest to get. And a lot of that's already been used. And so when they look at other sources of sediment where you didn't have 2 states competing or 2 communities competing for that sediment source, now you do have that. So we're starting to see more clashes of government entities primarily saying, that's our sand, we're going to take that sand, or we're going to pay for the sand, or how much that sand. So we're starting to see more of that as well.
Okay. That's interesting to me that there's not kind of, also it makes me wonder, in terms of funding. and scientific research that's being done. You know, it seems like everyone's having to do their own and put money into their own rather than everyone kind of sharing that. But I don't know. These are the issues we face, I suppose.
Well, again, historically, if you look at beach nourishment, we maintain a database of beach nourishment episodes, and we call each individual discrete emplacement of sand on the beach an episode. And the reason we call it an episode is because the Army Corps of Engineers, which is the federal agency that does federal beach nourishment projects, and there's a number of those, they're authorized for 50 years. Doesn't mean they're getting funding for 50 years, but the projects are authorized for 50 years, and so you have multiple nourishment episodes throughout that 50-year period, in theory. And so in order to prevent confusion when you're talking to somebody about nourishment, somebody might refer to those as projects, and we refer to them as episodes just for clarity. So, for example, an Army Corps of Engineer shore protection project in, let's say, Carolina Beach, North Carolina, will be comprised of 25 beach nourishment episodes. Okay. And so, in terms of funding, you brought up funding. So the federal government is a huge source of funding for nourishment. The Army Corps of Engineers gets their funding, and they go out and spend a lot of money planning projects. Most of the expense for a federal shore protection project, now that's beach nourishment, but they refer to that as shore protection. And one of the questions I've had for different individuals at meetings, I'll just kind of ask them, say, are you protecting the shore from something, or are you protecting something from the shore? Right, because shore protection is not really clear. I don't know what you mean. So federal government pays a large share of federal projects. The trend over the last decade or so is for the federal government to be stepping away from these large projects and for counties and communities to fund nourishment on their own. And there's a number of mechanisms, as you can imagine, how these communities and counties are looking to cobble the money together. And so we're seeing more locally funded, we call it locally funded nourishment episodes. But one of the issues with these nourishment that are not being paid for by the federal government, and it's a whole different discussion of why that is good or bad, is when a non-federal project episode is done, if a storm happens to come, and it's a storm that's great enough to be resulting in a federal presidential declaration of disaster, the federal government, through FEMA, that was a whole other agency, but FEMA will come in and pay to have sand put back on beaches that was taken away during a storm. And so what that has become over the last 10 years or so is the federal government, instead of funding nourishment projects, is acting as an insurance company for these locally funded nourishment projects. Episodes, projects, I don't use it. They're interchangeable. And so there's an awareness now amongst coastal communities and counties and property owners and homeowners associations and engineering consultants that if you can get enough money together and get that beach nourished, if a storm comes through, your insurance policy is FEMA who will come in and put that sand back on. So in a way, the federal government is still paying a lot of the cost of a lot of these non-federal nourishment episodes.
Okay. So I wonder, have you seen a decrease in episodes, in nourishment episodes, since the federal government kind of stopped being the first people to fund?
We have seen a decrease in very large nourishment episodes. We have seen an increase overall in the amount of nourishment. And that's because we can fast forward or look at climate change, global warming, sea level rise, and the impacts that these processes are having on developed shorelines. So we're seeing increased tidal differences. We're seeing increased tidal fluctuations, higher tides, higher waves during storms, larger storms like Sandy is a good example where you can't pinpoint, or you can't show a correlation or relationship, a direct relationship between any event, single event, and let's say global warming or sea level rise. But when you start seeing large differences or many differences over a period of time, the evidence is there. And Sandy, even though I wouldn't say the reason Sandy is a direct result of climate change or sea level rise or global warming, it's a storm that was very, very late in the season, uncharacteristically late. It was end of October, early November. It hit at high tide with a full moon, which you look back 100 years, if it hit at that exact same tide at that full moon in the same location, the impacts probably would have been much, much less. Also because there's a lot less development out there.
Yes.
That's a whole other issue. And so we're seeing more efforts to protect economic development because there is more going on to threaten it. And even though we don't know for sure what might happen in the next 50, 100 years, all indications that it's going to get a lot worse.
Yes.
And it's not going to get better. So we just feel like our professional experience and opinion tells us that more and more efforts are going to be made, and if beach nourishment doesn't do what people want it to do, we're going to start seeing other attempts to keep shorelines in place, which would have even bigger environmental impacts, cost even more, and have much larger long-term, cumulative long-term impacts.
Do you know what those would look like? Those other...
Those would look like giant walls.
Okay.
Where dunes are, primarily. If you can imagine any beach where you go to the beach and there's a dune between the beach and what's behind the beach, giant concrete walls will go up, and which will result in the loss of the beach because that shoreline is still moving. And instead of being brought back out and brought back out with sand, it's going to move up to that wall, and that beach is going to disappear. And that's a fact everywhere in the world at all times. When there's a seawall and a beach is eroding, that beach disappears. And so what you would need is a seawall and nourishment at that time.
Okay.
And seawalls are extremely expensive. They have huge negative environmental impacts. And so now you're combining nourishment and walls moving forward.
Yeah.
And again, the reason we're looking at that is society as a whole is very interested in keeping what's behind the beach there. So we're trying to bring up a debate or discussion and say, okay, let's take another look at developed shorelines. Instead of the beach moving being the problem, we look at it as what's placed behind that moving beach is the problem. And when you nod your head and you think about it, it seems like a very simple distinction, right? But it's not. And so if the problem is what we put there, our solutions should address what we put there. If the problem in your head is the moving beach, then your solutions are going to address the moving beach. So we're saying, that's not the problem because these beaches are moving all over the world where there's nothing behind it, and it's not a problem.
Yes.
It's only put so in our view, and a lot of our colleagues' views are, it's not the processes and the moving beach that's the problem, it's what we've placed there. And so if we can get beyond, we like what we have, we want it there at all times, and then a lot of these issues would change. A lot of these problems, there'd still be problems. How we address them would change. The amount of money we spent would probably be reduced. The environmental impacts they would be much more environmentally benign. We could have more long-term sustainability in our coastal ecosystems. There's a lot of tremendous benefits of looking at these issues differently, but nobody is.
Okay.
And there's mostly political and economic reasons.
Yeah. Do you think that in the future going forward, especially in this current climate, and with the rising effects of dangers and threats like climate change that are obviously impacting our shores more with, increased flooding risk and rising seas, do you think that there is the chance that we'll start looking at this situation as the problem is what we've developed there rather than the land itself?
I'd like to say yes.
Yes.
My answer is I don't know. I feel like at some point in some places there will be no alternative other than to look at how we react to rising seas and global warming and increased storminess, or bigger storms that last longer, or that have more of an impact, that may be slower moving. Whatever the changes are that will impact humans, I don't believe we can continue doing what we're doing. That's not sustainable. We can do it in the short term, and we're going to do it in the short term. By we, I mean society as a whole. But there are places already that are already thinking about doing things different. That would be on a small scale, North Topsail Beach, North Carolina, a small coastal community that's spent over $30 million nourishing their beaches They don't have a lot there. They've scraped it together, but they cannot continue to do that.
Yes.
They are running out of sand, compatible sand that's relatively affordable. So they're not going to have any choice but to do something different. And then we look at places like Charleston, who are not coastal. I mean, they're coastal. They're riverine coastal, and they're impacted by tides, and they are experiencing greater flooding. The flooding impacts are greater. The frequency is more, and that is simply from lunar tides. Tides that are normal but now are higher because sea level is increasing. And so they're seeing flooding streets. They're having issues with their infrastructure that's impacted by salt water and fresh water mixing under the ground. They're spending a lot of money creating these pumps that will pump water out of the city. Miami, which has a tremendous investment in economic development on the beach, has no sand. They have no compatible sand, so they're looking at importing sand from the Bahamas, which brings up a whole another set of political and economic issues. Not to mention the environmental impacts of importing sand from other countries. So there are pockets of places that are now being forced to at least think about how are they going to address these issues moving forward.
Okay.
And there will be more and more as we move forward.
Yeah. What do you think that some of the ways to address those issues would be? Would it just be, moving people out, getting rid of some of the development? I can't quite imagine it in my mind of what it would consist of.
It would consist of a whole bunch of different things.
Okay.
Right? And so the program, PISDIS, has been labeled over the years as anti-development. We want anything on the beach. We want to get everybody off the beach, which is completely untrue.
Yes.
Our approach is we need to be realistic. We need to be practical. We need to look longer term. The decisions that are made are typically made by politicians, and politicians are looking at the next election.
Yes.
They're made by property owners who can afford having property on the beach, who have the means and the affluence to be able to influence decisions made by politicians who are looking at the next election. And so we're looking at managing shorelines from a more geologic perspective. So instead of looking 2, 4, 6 years down the road, which very few people do, we're looking 50, 100 years down the road.
Yes.
And we're looking bigger picture. So we're not looking at an individual property or a community or a county. We're looking nationwide or regional, northeast, southeast, Gulf.
Okay.
All right, and what's best for that region, for the most people and the environment over a long period of time. That is going to include a whole bunch of different strategies, including beach nourishment in a lot of places where it's feasible or it would make fiscal sense to do that. One of the issues that we're trying to deal with now is to prevent a lot of developed shorelines from becoming so developed that the alternatives that are available to them moving forward are limited. And I'll give you an example. Areas like Myrtle Beach, Miami Beach, Atlantic City, Virginia Beach. Did I say Virginia Beach?
No.
Let me start again. Miami Beach, Myrtle Beach, Virginia Beach, Atlantic City are so densely developed with such huge structures that there are no alternatives to dealing with a rising sea and storms other than stabilizing that shoreline through nourishment and or seawalls moving forward. The vast majority of our developed shorelines haven't even approached that level of development. Single family homes, duplexes are getting bigger and bigger, but there's still alternatives that are available to these communities. North Topsail Beach, again, being a great example where if they don't have sand to nourish their beach and they don't build a wall because they can't afford building the walls, and they're going to have to do something with their development. And that is going to include some sort of proactive, structured relocation plan, maybe combined with nourishment in some places that makes it less expensive. And so we're gonna be forced to have to address these issues. And what I'm envisioning is that there's going to be a mix. It's going to be a combination of things done depending on the specific location and development that's there.
I wonder. So that makes me think of North Carolina specifically, if we're sticking to state. We have the Outer Banks, which seems very unique to North Carolina. I wonder how specifically, I can imagine this is impacting that area a lot. So what have they seen thus far as is this something that could cause the people, because I know the Outer Banks is very thin as well, could this cause the people there to just have to completely move and eventually we won't have the Outer Banks anymore, I'm wondering?
There are coastal geologists who predict in 100 years that a significant portion of the Outer Banks will be gone. I don't know if that will ever happen. I don't know if we'll let that happen, but we may not have a choice in some places. The Outer Banks are a thin strip of land, and if you got up in a plane and looked down on it, you would see how narrow it really is. It's long and narrow. And the wave energy on the Outer Banks is among the highest in the country, just because of its location and the processes that occur there. The Outer Banks also has this aura that it's this remote, windswept, pirate-laden, historic shipwreck area that people fantasize or romance about. So it has a romantic connotation. In the last 10 years, a little over 10 years, close to $100 million has been spent nourishing beaches on the Outer Banks. Prior to that, $0 were spent. For them, let me correct myself. Very, very little was spent nourishing. There were some very, very small nourishing episodes down by the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse and to protect Highway 12. But it went from windswept, wild area to now it's just another artificially stabilized set of beaches. And is that going to impact tourism? I don't know, probably not. Is that going to impact what they're able to do moving forward in 50, 100 years? Probably, depending on how these stabilization efforts then are viewed by the local governments and what they do or do not do in terms of allowing additional development to occur. So the key for moving forward and being able to maintain some reasonable balance between economic vitality, which is important, and maintaining a relatively natural ecosystem on the beach and offshore and behind the islands, and it's all interchanged, is the key. And the key to that is what is in that particular location behind that beach will dictate what can and cannot happen, how much it will cost, what the impacts will be. And so a lot of places want to develop very rapidly because they view that as a positive thing. There are some places that have said, you know what, we better watch what we're doing development-wise because we do know we're going to have to start thinking differently. Few and far between, but more and more. So there is a trend in that direction. So there's an awareness. There is an awareness. But again, it really depends on who's making these decisions and who has the ear of the people making these decisions. So that's where the politics comes in.
There we go. So we're in Western North Carolina. You guys are focused in Western North Carolina. This is where you're doing the research, which is very interesting to me. You know, we're pretty far from any beaches that you could actually physically get out on. So I'm wondering why, I guess first of all, how does that play out in your work? But also, why are these issues relevant for the people here as well, not just those who live on the coast?
All right, it's a good question. So I'll address the issue of program for the study of adult shorelines being located in the mountains of North Carolina. Because we don't do field work per se, we're not out measuring beaches every day, we're not doing sampling, it doesn't matter where we are. It really doesn't matter. The program is located at Duke in Durham for the first 20 years, 4 hours from the beach. We have a marine lab, but distance is irrelevant. In fact, because we do a lot of policy-related and management work, it has turned out that being removed from that political environment has been a tremendous asset for us to allow us to be much more objective in a lot of the things that we believe and we're able to say. I have colleagues at UNCW, East Carolina University, other places in the United States where they go to the grocery store on a Saturday afternoon after writing an op-ed in the local paper, and they get accosted by their neighbors who say, how dare you say that about this, or I can't believe you said that, or I disagree with that. And a lot of our colleagues are then have been reluctant to speak out on a lot of contentious issues. Being removed from that has allowed us the freedom to be able to continue to advocate for what we believe from our professional experience and is best for the beach. So distance irrelevant, being removed from the political environment of directly being there, benefit. we've gotten more involved in South Carolina issues because now it's
Okay.
easier to get to South Carolina Beach.
Yes.
We've gotten down to the Gulf quite extensively. I know when you fly places, it doesn't really matter, but we've driven to the Gulf after the BP incident in 2010.
Mm-hmm.
We do a lot of aerial photography and video monitoring. So we're constantly traveling, so it's easier to get to the Gulf.
Yeah.
And the reason why it's important for everybody, the reason why we feel like we do what we do, is for the benefit of, like I said earlier, we're looking out for the long-term sustainability of beaches. But the reason that is important and why we're doing it is because the beach is owned by everybody. Now, there may be a perception that property owners own the beach, and I don't want to get into the legalese, but they own some portion of the beach. But the vast majority of the coast is what's called a public trust resource. It is owned by everybody in the state, managed by whatever individual state, for long-term perpetuity of everybody. And so when we take field, it makes much more sense when you're out there on one of our field courses, when we look at not being able to walk down the public trust beach because somebody has done something to their property to prevent access, such as building a wall, building a sandbag, seawall. There's all different kinds of things. But the one thing I always harp on for my students or anybody I'm talking to is, the reason that this is important, and you should care about it, whether you live in Cullowhee, North Carolina, or Topeka, Kansas, is these beaches are all of ours, and we really should care, and we do care about what happens to them. And is it fair for a very, very, very small number of people to make decisions that could have profound long-term impacts on these important resources that we all love going to, we all own? We don't realize we own it, but we do own it. And so these are the questions that need to be asked at every level, whether it's local, federal, or state. Like I said, do property owners primarily have the right to do things to protect their property if it impacts the public trust resource, which is the beach?
Okay.
So I don't have the answer to that, but these questions need to be asked. So our entire discussion is focused on sandy beaches.
Yes.
The process that impact beaches are also impacting soundside shorelines and estuarine shorelines to a lesser degree, but the actual amount of shoreline is being impacted significantly greater than the ocean front. And so traditionally, again, looking back over time, up until just recently, property owners who saw their property eroding, or migrating as we like to call it, would build structural defenses, mostly bulkheads, which are vertical wooden walls, to keep that shoreline in place. And just like on the ocean, the processes are still occurring, so you would lose anything that's seaward of these walls. And what's seaward of these walls typically are very vital habitats for fisheries, where fisheries spawn, where crabs and clams live, and everything we like to eat, a lot of things we like to eat, live on the other side of islands in these estuarine systems. And so the shift has been away, just like on the ocean front, where the shift has been towards nourishment, which is a soft stabilizational term. It's called soft because sand is soft. On the backsides of islands, there's also been a similar shift away from bulkheads and other kinds of structural strategies to living shorelines or more resilient types of approaches, such as replanting native vegetation. So down in Florida, you might have mangroves. In North Carolina, you may have spartina or different kinds of marsh vegetation that's native. The problems, even though that's much better strategy than building a wall, is a lot of times planting this vegetation, the vegetation cannot be successful because storms come, or there's a higher tide than normal or something. And so in order to establish areas of vegetation on the exposed sound or bay or whatever the body of water is, there has to be some sort of protection for it. And so a lot of times the protection for the softer stabilization consists of a rock wall, which is counterintuitive and counterproductive. And so the trend very, very recently has been away from these rock walls, which are called sills. The term is a sill. It just baffles the wave energy coming in. So looking at more sustainable approaches such as oyster reefs, looking at using biodegradable kinds of things, whether it's fabric, which I don't think we're there yet, but logs, just trees that are native to the area. They line them up and they'll disintegrate over time. So there's been a tremendous shift very quickly on stabilizing or the approach to stabilizing or not stabilizing estuarine shorelines. And so for some reason there's been the trajectory on that has been much faster away from the more negative types of things to the more again environmentally benign types of approaches.
Okay.
Which is encouraging.
Yes,
right?
very encouraging.
Right.
That's what
And I would attribute that to not. I mean, we're not going to take credit, but entities like ourselves and our sister institutions with a lot of research on the negatives of these walls and the positives of doing things other, and grassroots environmental groups and conservation organizations at every level, and just a tremendous educational and public awareness efforts by these groups have gotten property owners to understand the benefits of doing things differently. And while you would think it might be more difficult to get huge numbers of people on the backside of islands to do things differently, it appears that they're much more amenable to doing it like that. So it's kind of interesting. I don't know why. Maybe I don't know, but
it is working.
It is moving that way.
Yeah.
Right. So.
It's very encouraging. Maybe we can also see that on the sandy beaches.
Well, we can only continue to plug away and do what we do, and we look at our role as an academic university research center. We have no authority to do anything. We're not elected officials. We don't have any money. But what our role is we like to educate the decision makers and give them the information they need to make the best decisions for the greater good over the longest period of time. And so that's our role. If we've been successful, I don't know. I think we've been somewhat successful in that.
Yeah. Well, you always have to start somewhere. So, and hopefully conversations like this can get more people in tune with these things, and so they know more. But it's the hope.
Well, again, the trend is looking favorable in the longer term, but until we get there, we don't really know what's going to happen.
Very true. Well, thank you so much, Andy.
Well, thank you, Olivia. Appreciate it.
I've certainly learned a lot today, so it's been
my
very
pleasure.
exciting. But we really appreciate Andy being here, and I hope you all learned a lot as well. But thank you so much.
Thanks.